The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is the 6th day, the second to the last day, and actually there's not even 2 days left, because this is in the afternoon, late in the afternoon on the 6th day of this 7-day sesshin here at Mountain Gate, the first sesshin in January 2020. There's another sesshin in January 2020, but that one is at Hidden Valley Zen Center in Southern California. We try to make hay while the sun shines. As the saying goes, life is short. How much time do we have to realize the incredible depths of awakening that we can open to, that are built in? All we have to do is open to them. And we have an amazingly effective practice, several amazingly effective practices, is certainly sufficient to come to awakening. And of course, these days, most people don't come to profound awakening in the first go-round. They come to a much lighter level of awakening, but still, that's significant. It's definitely significant. And of course, after that, it's important to keep on going, to go deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. It will make an enormous difference in your world, in the world of other people, even those that you haven't any personal contact with. Today I would like to continue with this very fascinating book entitled No Self, No Problem, How Neuropsychology is Catching Up to Buddhism by Chris Niebauer, PhD, a professor who is a cognitive neuropsychologist. In other words, he has studied for a very long time it says here the left and right sides of the human brain, because the brain is divided into two what are known as hemispheres, and each of them, while they have some crossover, and they do talk to each other, they seem to have some specific focuses that are different from each other, and that includes the realm of language. Left brain, as you've been hearing all week so far, is the master of words and words making up stories. Now we're getting to the role of the right brain. This is chapter 4, the basics of right brain consciousness. And Rumi is quoted here just under the title, "Silence is a language of God, all else is poor translation." Silence is the language of God, all else is poor translation. And the right brain is paramount with silence and able to function fully in the midst of silence without any overt instructions, without any words. So, in December 1996, the history of neuroscience was forever changed when Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor suffered a stroke that took much of her left brain offline. You can go online to, there are many different sources of this. She has done a video called My Stroke of Insight, I think it is. Either that or My Stroke of Enlightenment, I don't know which, in which she actually tells about her experience. It was written up as well in the New York Times. She is, or certainly was, a PhD scientist, and her actual focus in science was the anatomy of the brain, which is really interesting that she should then have a stroke. It's as if she was doing her own, unwittingly, of course, doing her own experiments. In what must be a grand cosmic coincidence, this event happened to a neuroanatomist In other words, Taylor was someone who had spent her life before the stroke labeling and categorizing the brain, using the very part of her brain, the left hemisphere, that would be, for the first time, turned off, opening up center stage for her right brain consciousness. It's worth going online and watching and hearing her own words about this. It's quite phenomenal. Years later, after recovering from the injury, and it took her 8 years to recover, Taylor's left brain was able to tell the story. During the stroke, her constant inner voice was silent for the first time. As the inner language quieted, she reports, quote, "I became detached from the memories of my life, and I was confronted by an expanding sense of grace," close quote. She could no longer perceive the boundaries of where she ended and everything else began. She felt her being as fluid rather than solid. She was totally in the present moment, embodied in tranquility. Embodied in tranquility, that is a capacity of the right brain. Categories such as good/bad and right/wrong were experienced as a continuum rather than disconnected opposites. Her left brain ego, which viewed herself as separate, was no longer dominant in her consciousness. In her right brain, or perhaps her right mind, ? She felt gratitude and a sense of contentment. The right brain was compassionate, nurturing, and eternally optimistic. In her words, quote, "I think the Buddhists would say I entered the mode of existence they call nirvana," close quote. It is important to point out that neuroscience is still trying to make sense of exactly what Taylor's experience means insofar as our understanding of the brain. However, one cannot help but wonder, as she did, whether her experience was similar to that of the Buddha, Lao Tzu, or the ancient Hindus that wrote the Vedas. In some ways, her experience is exactly what many people hope to attain when they meditate or practice mindfulness. And these qualities of gratitude, contentment, compassion, nurturing, and eternally optimistic, we too can access these through practice. And I don't mean practice being that way. I mean our Zen practice in working with the extended out breath in particular, and also with koans, to open to that right brain expression. Of course, no one would sign up to experience a life-threatening stroke as a means to enlightenment. A more practical approach might be in this question: what would happen if we could turn down the left brain? And that's what Susokan does. If we persist, we find ourselves in a place of quiet presence, of ease, of let-go-ness. But that's only a beginning. Would this mean that the left brain could no longer inhibit the right brain? Perhaps this right brain bliss is always on and we're just not identifying with it. If you are familiar with Buddhism, you may have heard the expression that, quote, "you're already a Buddha, you just don't know it," close quote. Based on what happened to Taylor, we might surmise that these right brain processes are already being carried out to some degree. We just need to connect to or identify with them somehow, or perhaps we simply need to wake up to them. After all, Buddha simply means one who is awake. It took years of rehabilitation to bring Taylor's left brain back to a functioning level. So even after this experience of bliss, she still worked very hard so that her left brain would function. She still needed it to move through the world and to continue her work. Perhaps the future of our happiness depends on finding a balance for the left brain interpreter. In my view, the goal is not right brain dominance, and certainly not shut down the left brain, but rather to achieve what Buddha called a middle path. By the way, this experience, whatever you want to call it, and it certainly was an experience of deep insight that she had as a result of the stroke. After she recovered, Even though she was still able to pursue science, she pursued it differently. There were choices that she had naturally made prior to the stroke that now shifted in importance. And one of them, if I remember right, was that she ceased experimenting with animals. She became naturally, she didn't become, she just was more open to being her natural, compassionate self. And we all have that capacity. Could Jill Bolte Taylor, post-stroke, illustrate a living example of this balanced path? She thinks about how she can now choose to enter right brain bliss. She talks about how she can now choose to enter right brain bliss, a place she good naturally calls La La Land. But she can also focus on left brain processing to get things done, communicate with others, and solve the practical problems that come up in life. And then he continues, a closer look at the right side of the brain. After focusing on the left brain, it is now time to delve into the right side of the brain and see if what neuroscience has learned about this hemisphere also supports the idea that the self is a fiction. Of course, this is the basis of this book. No self, no problem. Of course, this is also where we run into a dilemma. Since you're likely not a split brain patient reading this book in a controlled experiment, both sides of your brain will receive the information presented next. Because of this, I encourage you to notice when the left brain, which wants to be the master of the conversation, dismisses any of the ideas presented next as, quote, unimportant, close quote, meaningless, close quote, or silly, close quote, or otherwise looks for some way to reject them and maintain its dominance. It's interesting that people generally, not everybody, but in general, it's enough we can generalize with this statement, are so self-involved that in interactions with each other, conversations, for example, they will be ostensibly listening to what the other person has to say, but all the time they're refuting what it is in their own mind and just waiting for the moment when they can come up with a rebuttal. It was sort of interesting when I was living in Turkey, and there's a classic hello, how are you, fine, thank you, how are you interaction when two people encounter each other. And the funny thing is that before the person can say, how are you, the other person has said, fine, thank you. So, hello, fine, thank you. Skipping over the whole conversation. It's so automatic. Remember that even though your right brain can't speak in the traditional sense, it does understand language on its own, as the case studies with the split brain patients demonstrated. The extent that you understand the ideas presented here will, of course, rely on my ability to explain them, but could also be indicative of your ability to move beyond identification with the left brain interpreter. So let's take a closer look at the speechless right brain, because as you will soon see, it is a fitting example of the age-old axiom that wisdom is often found in silence. In many ways, the right brain is the yin to the yang of the left brain. For instance, in the same way that the left brain is categorical, the right brain takes a more global approach to what it perceives. Rather than dividing things into categories and making judgments that separate the world, the right brain gives attention to the whole scene and processes the world as a continuum. Flow. When we are fully engaged in an activity, so fully engaged in that activity that we forget ourselves, we enter what has been termed flow. I think it was Michael Jordan that came up with that name as an explanation of how he could make basket after basket after basket without thinking about how to do it. That is experiencing the world as a continuum. It's a rather wondrous mind state. There's no space for judgment. There's no space for self-criticism or any other criticism. It's really as if the left brain critiquer is given a break, and the right brain is functioning as it can without any instructions. Whereas the attention of the left brain is focused and narrow, the right brain is broad, vigilant, and attends to the big picture. Whereas the left brain focuses on the local elements, the right brain processes the global form that the elements create. The left brain is sequential, separating time into before that and after this, while the right brain is focused on the immediacy of the present moment. The experience described by Taylor begins to make sense when we understand how the right brain processes information. Another way to summarize the differences between the left and right brain is that the left brain is the language center and the right brain is the spatial center. While admittedly this is reductive, it is a helpful way to summarize decades of research. Language is categorical. It looks at one word at a time with a narrow focus, either as you read or as you speak. When we process the space around us, we deal with the whole at once, not individual parts, but how the parts are all connected as they are in any picture. And then he gives the example of classic picture where there's a dot, a solid circle. Two of them actually, one surrounded by great big circles that are much larger than it, and the other surrounded by much smaller circles than it is. And you're asked to tell which center dot is the bigger dot. And perceptively, you can say that the dot that is surrounded by the smaller dots is larger than the dot surrounded by the bigger dots, but that's not actually true. They're both the same size. I remember a long time ago listening to a talk by Albert Lowe while we were all training at the Zen Center. He was asked to give a Dharma talk, and he started out holding up a picture. It's a classic picture from psychology that is probably relatively familiar to you. If you look at it in one way, or I should say if you focus on one part of the picture, it looks like a pair of vases next to each other. If you focus on it in a different way, it looks like two faces looking at each other. It's called the figure in the ground picture. And he was comparing that to our mind, how we normally see just one of those foci, either the figure or the ground, and yet as we go deeper and deeper and deeper in our practice, we are able to see, in essence, both sides of the coin, or both the figure and the ground, and toggle back and forth in our own mind between them two. Right brain, left brain. They both have terrific abilities. Both, in a sense, are essential to our normal functioning, our normal way of moving around in the world. But you've also heard the report that there was a woman, I think she's still alive, who was born with only one hemisphere. And I'm thinking it might have been the left brain, but I don't recall that it was actually spoken of specifically, just that she had one hemisphere, not two. And the result was she had a very difficult time navigating in space. She couldn't tell time looking at clocks. And yet, as a child, she was able somehow to train her single hemisphere to do the work of both hemispheres, and was able to learn to read clocks and watches and navigate in space with confidence and ease, and eventually got a PhD and set up an institute in Toronto, I believe it is, where she was teaching. They offer teaching to people who are dyslexic or otherwise have challenges in functioning. It's amazing what this glob of goo in our head can do. But is that who we are? We have two different perspectives right in the same, well, container. Left brain and right brain. And the left brain, Dr. Niebauer surmises, is the source of suffering. He also points out that it is not, it's not something we want to get rid of. We do want to be able to navigate with words, understand pictures, understand categories, understand puzzles, understand rules and rights and wrongs and all the rest of that. But that emphasis that we grow up with in this culture is lopsided. I think often of certain Native American tribes who raise their children not with a left brain emphasis. They're, in a sense, the more I think about it, it's more right brain. Children at a certain age start asking why. Why is the sky blue? Why do I have to go to bed? Why is this? Why is that? Why is the other thing? And when you answer, they'll say, why? But Native American children are told, rather than some specific answer, they said, go into the woods and be really, really quiet. And the trees and the bushes will tell you why. And if you've been around Native Americans very much, there's a high percentage of them that have this inner quality of silence. Whereas the rest of us have a great deal of difficulty with any level of silence unless we've been practicing Zen for a while or are naturally right-brain people. But all this eventually gets to whether there is a self that exists. A clever study that demonstrates the accuracy of the right brain's spatial processing, researchers presented subjects with blocks of different sizes to replicate the above illusion, which is the illusion of different size dots. Subjects were carefully videotaped as they were asked to reach out and grab the center block in each cluster, and the right brain performed perfectly. Even if the left brain thought, quote unquote, the center blocks were different sizes, the right brain held the thumb and fingers the exact same distance apart. That is, the right brain wasn't fooled by the illusion like you are. This experiment also leads us to another vital misunderstanding about the right brain. The subjects in this experience didn't think about their fingers being the same distance apart as they reached for each circle. In other words, looking at the thing, you could assume that one of these circles is bigger than the other. And yet, when these subjects of the study reached for the circle in the middle, whether it was the one that they might think was bigger or the one they might think was smaller, their fingers were apart the same distance. In other words, some part of them felt that the circles really were the same size. The subjects in this experience didn't think about their fingers being the same distance apart as they reached for each circle. The choice was unconscious as far as the left brain was concerned. This label of unconscious is inherently negative in scientific usage and is a subtle way the left brain asserts its role as master. The effects of this label can be seen across multiple disciplines. For instance, bodily and mental functions that don't require conscious thought or interpretation have largely been deemed of lesser importance by Western science and philosophy. But it's important to note that philosophers and neuroscientists have labeled these things, quote, unconscious, close quote, simply because they're outside of the language sphere, even though they're still complex neurological behaviors. Think of your cardiovascular system or your digestive system as basic examples. They're doing very complex things all the time, things that could not be done without the brain. But because their actions are beyond the realm of the left brain thinking, they aren't paid much attention by the interpreter. But much like the functioning of these vital and necessary systems, the right brain's activities are just a form of consciousness that we've been taught to dismiss and devalue, not surprisingly by the left brain. You can experience this for yourself right now. Take a moment and raise your arm above your head. How'd you do that? Can you explain it? Do you have to think about how to move your arm, or do you just move it? To say that the very act of movement is somehow unconscious is to make thinking the master, yet thinking is not necessary for movement. Sure, you can think to yourself, I would like to move my arm now, but the act itself needs no mental support. Nobody telling it to move. No self instructing it to move. Next, I'd like you to reach out for any object near you and grab hold of it. This demonstrates your ability to accurately determine the distance between things in space, their spatial reality. Did you grab something without any problem? Or did you hand reach out and miss the item altogether? Most likely it was the former. Now, how much did you think about this as far as traditional interpretive consciousness is concerned? Can you explain to me how you grabbed it? Here again, thinking wasn't required. You just did it. Because there was no story necessary for reaching out and grabbing something, it seems as if you were not conscious of how this is done due to our bias of identifying with a language-based interpretive consciousness. However, it's important to notice that these examples, either moving your arm above your head or grabbing an object in front of you, are both highly complex and conscious activities, even though they're outside the language sphere. They're simply given very little importance because the left brain enjoys playing the master. And that sounds very much like a left brain statement. Because we don't have words to even describe how we do movement, many will consider it meaningless to ask if it is conscious. The most common answer from my students to the question, how'd you do that? Is a blank look and the response, I don't know, I just did it. Dismissing this action as unconscious is a result of our over-dependence on a language-based interpretive consciousness. Our interpretive pattern perceiver cannot imagine a world without. So how can one become more conscious of the right brain system? Well, in one sense, you're already quite conscious of it, but the bias of seeing the world mostly through the lens of the interpreter only makes it seem like you're not. Of course, when I say you, quote unquote, I don't mean your ego, because the ego genuinely cannot experience the right brain consciousness even if it wants to, as it is a left brain construct only. Although there are many ways to access consciousness of right brain activities, due to the lack of labels and words, it can be difficult to express this form of consciousness. Still, let's look at a few of them quickly. The practice of yoga which has been around for thousands of years and is mentioned in the oldest religious texts of India, brings you into right brain consciousness. You're doing movements. You typically feel good when you do them. You're aware of what you are doing, but there is very little to think about. In fact, the whole practice is best done by, quote, being in the moment, close quote, or not getting lost in the machinations of the interpreter while you're doing it. I can't think of a single practitioner of yoga who would ever believe that one is unconscious during the practice. I also find it interesting that the word yoga means union, the union of your true self and the rest of the universe, which is one. There's no separate true self. The practice of meditation in its various forms also brings you into right brain consciousness. Zazen, or the seated meditation practice in most Zen schools, often instructs beginners to be conscious of their breath, which brings their attention into the present moment. And here we go. That is Susokan. At least one form of that is Susokan. No one would say that any of these practices are unconscious. Rather, many describe them as a very alert form of consciousness that is difficult to put into words. However, just because something cannot be put into words does not make it unconscious. This echoes the wisdom of the ancient Eastern philosophers who said that the real world couldn't be put into words, and anything put into words was not the real world. Beyond words and letters. This is the part of the famous saying of Bodhidharma. And we think about the practices, the martial art practices that are taught in Japan, which is highly seasoned in Zen and awareness, right brain work. You're taught not to focus on the target, but to be present when you're shooting the arrow. When you become the arrow and the target, that's when you succeed. And it's interesting that Professor Niebuhr talks about doing martial arts. In the first match he ever did, when he was doing practicing a martial art, he immediately got a high rating for his first move. And then he started thinking about it and thinking how nice it would be to win a prize or get some positive attention for doing so well. And after that, his ability to do those forms went downhill, because he wasn't doing the forms, he was thinking about them. What is it that thinks? If Jill Bolte-Taylor could be conscious, having a stroke, it's interesting, she talks about going in and out of what we would call left and right brain connection. She knew something was wrong, and she knew she needed help. So she went to the telephone and tried to call a colleague of hers. She couldn't talk. And she also went back and forth. She had to kind of put her finger on the number in the telephone book where her colleague was, in order to then match that number with the number on the telephone. And then there would be a temporary gap where she wasn't conscious of that. And then she'd go back into consciousness and able to conceive of the numbers again, and see the pattern again, and go back and forth, and was finally able to make the call connect, but she couldn't speak. Luckily, her colleague recognized the telephone number that she was calling from, or somehow understood that it was her and was able to get help. Little children, very little children, supposedly, according to science, their brains do not come fully online to the point of being able to function in the realm of words, of thoughts, until they're about 1.5 years old. But they manage to function fine before that time. What makes this self-image? If we're in the flow, we're so absorbed in whatever we're doing. It's a wondrous mind state, really. It's talked about. People work hard to get in the flow in sports. It's thought that some of the highs that come, the runner's high, for example, the intense highs that can come from rock climbing, come as a result of such total focus that people that are doing them are in the flow. Where's the self-image in that moment? In essence, it doesn't exist, because there's no somebody looking on and describing, oh, I'm reaching up now with my right hand into that little piece of outcropping, and then I'm going to reach up there to the left and pull myself up in that very, very, very narrow indentation. There is just when we are in the flow, there is just the reaching, instinctively understanding where to put our foot next. And that can happen in many realms of our life. When I was living in Turkey and had started doing Zen practice and realized that I needed to be in an environment where I would have to practice and would have access to a teacher, and yet there I was in Turkey with very little income, and I knew of the Rochester Zen Center in Rochester, New York. I'd never been to Rochester, New York, although my grandmother was born and raised there. And she used to talk about the lilacs in the parks in the spring and the big mansions on East Avenue. That's what I knew about Rochester, New York, aside from the fact that the Rochester Zen Center was there and Philip Kepler was the teacher. And there was some inner sense, and I could not put it into words other than to say that it feels like what I should do, what I need to do, and even that doesn't carry it. There was just a sense that the appropriate direction to move in was to leave Turkey and go to Rochester. I didn't know whether I could find work. I didn't know a single soul there. And yet I had a sense that it was exactly the right thing to do, and it turns out that it was exactly the right thing to do. And another time in my life as well, when I made a major move because there was a sense that it was exactly the right thing to do, was when I went to live at Sogenji. I had been there briefly for 2 months and come back knowing that I needed to return. There was just some inner sense that I needed to return. But in the intervening months, I got 3 very serious, life-threatening, really, any one of them could have killed me, illnesses. I got hepatitis, and then hard on the heels of hepatitis, I got meningitis, encephalitis, and then a secondary infection that took out the seventh nerve in my face, on the right side of my face. It made me look like a Halloween nightmare. I ended up with chronic fatigue. I had to move out of the Zen Center and was staying with a friend of mine in her home. And one day, another Sangha member came to bring a casserole. And I went down the stairs and sat for 15 minutes in a chair with this person, just lightly chatting, no stress, and was profoundly exhausted. Just for 15 minutes sitting in a chair. And yet I knew it was the right thing